fascinating, as you probably do as well. The good news is that every day we can all work to keep our brains healthier in small but significant ways. Now, brain problems are potentially life-threatening, and this is a disclaimer because these presentations and information are not a substitute for professional help, and it does not remove the need to monitor those at risk, and does not constitute medical advice or consultation in any way. It is your responsibility to attend your doctor and review these options with your chosen health professional, whether a doctor or another professional. Now, this is a fairly recent paper. What is brain health and why is it important? And this is from the British Medical Journal, a leading journal of medicine in the world. And this is the primary author. Dr. Wang is chief physician in the neurology department of a Beijing hospital, which is associated with Capital Medical University in Beijing. And Dr. Wang and his colleagues discussed the definition of brain health, and also let me see, sorry, there's things in the way here. And also the definition of brain health and the opportunities and challenges of future research into the brain. So what do they tell us? Well, they say, as we know, the human brain is the command center for the nervous system and the body. Also, it enables thoughts, memory, movement, and emotions by a complex functioning that is the highest product of biological evolution. Maintaining a healthy brain during one's life is the most essential goal in pursuing better health and longer life. Also, as the population ages, like myself, for example, and many of you, the burden of brain disorders and the challenges for the preservation of brain health increases. It is therefore vital to understand what brain health is and why it is important. This session today aims to introduce brain health, to discuss the effects of brain disorders on health, and to discuss how these disorders might be treated and prevented. So how would we describe brain health? Well, according to the National Institute of Aging, brain health, and there's their logo, brain health refers to how well a person's brain functions across several areas, including cognition, and cognition is another word for thinking, movement, and also emotion, and also touch and other sensory input like vision, hearing, etc. The World Health Organization provides a complementary definition. They define brain health as good brain health is a state in which every individual can realize their own abilities and optimize their cognitive, emotional, psychological, and behavioral functioning to cope with life situations. And as you know, we need a lot of things to help us cope, that's for sure. So, in short, brain health is a measure of how well the brain functions to support a person's daily activities of life. So that's what we're looking at today. Now, here's a cartoon of the brain. It's a little cartoon, and there's an electrical shock coming down from it, a voltage thing there. This is a cartoon, but there's an element of truth to this, because the brain is a bioelectrical organ. Now, I'm going to talk about the brain using this image, which goes into more detail. But let me just finish with this. The adult human brain runs continuously, whether you're awake or sleeping, on only about 12 watts of electrical power. For comparison, a typical laptop computer runs on around 60 watts of electrical power. And when you're sleeping, the brain is probably 90% active. It's not really asleep. You're asleep, but their brain is not asleep. Now, these are some areas of brain health, And if I had 5 hours, I would go into more detail, but I don't have 5 hours. There's a whole area of spirit and soul, which is important. I'm going to come back to that. There's the area of power of the mind, relaxation and healing, etc. And there's a brain. I won't have time for that. Working your body, Gordon Coe will talk about that. That's exercise. Surroundings, your physical and emotional surroundings are very important as well. Personal development is an important thing. Work-life balance would be part of that. So let me go on. This image was so big I had to split it into two. So the second half is next. But prevention and treatment, community is important, and conventional and complementary medical approaches to illness and disease are also important. Here's our lower half, but these are still important. These are just as important. Family and friends and coworkers. We are social beings. We need to have that for your brain to be healthy. Food and drink. Dr. Mary will talk about that. Nourishing and maybe not so great food. In other words, too fatty, too much salt, etc. So she'll probably talk about that. We also have to recharge the brain, and sleep is important. Some people don't think sleep is important. Yes, it is. So let me go on here. We don't have enough time, but there's one area here that if I had 10 more hours, I could talk about in more detail. And this is spirit and soul. But just quickly, for Christians, finding meaning and purpose and what we value in special revelation. That's the Holy Scripture. Also, we have general revelation, which is science and nature. And of course, all truths are God's truths. And we seek God in worship and prayer, and living and flourishing and being resilient when challenges come. And challenges do come. Have you noticed that in life? Challenges come. And in connecting with others and belonging. We belong to the kingdom. So I don't have time. If I had 20 more hours, we could talk more. But these are some of the good things they found with spiritual and religious belief and practice, is that it decreases alcohol abuse. It decreases depression. It decreases anxiety and stress, and decreases divorce. It increases marital and sexual satisfaction, and it increases overall happiness, and it increases psychological well-being and longevity. If we had more time, 20 more hours, we could talk about the studies. Now, this image that I've been using is a secular image. It's not from Christianity. And you can see in the middle here, it has me, 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 me. Well, that's not a secular, that is a secular view, but that's not a Christian view. So a secular, humanistic, so-called atheistic view would be me, myself, and I as the center of life. But that's not what Christians believe, of course. And we don't have to downrate the self, but the self is not the center. As C.S. Lewis said, true humility is not thinking less of yourself. You don't have to beat yourself up. It is thinking of yourself less. So what is in the center of Christian thinking and practice? Of course, it's Jesus. Jesus is the center. And I won't read that quote because you probably already read it. So peace comes from Jesus and in the presence of God. So here's an image of the brain rotating, and there's a whole bunch of different parts that they're showing here, and I don't have time. This is the brain is roughly 3 pounds, but it has 90 billion cells. Actually, it has 90 billion neurons that are brain cells, but it also has other support cells. Okay, and it's the most complicated object in the whole universe. Human beings have not found anything as complicated. It dwarfs how complicated a spaceship is. A spaceship is complicated, but a brain is much more complicated. And of course, if I had 30 more hours, I might be able to tell you the details. Here's a neuron talking to another neuron. It's sending messages, and they send message back and forth. But these are just 2 neurons. There's 90 billion neurons. So I can't show you 90 billion neurons, obviously, but we know that the brain is a lot of circuits, and all these nerve cells are linked together in many different ways, sometimes coming back to reconnect with other neurons in circuits. Now, this is a great cartoon of neurons in the brain. Of course, they won't really look like this, but it shows neurons connecting to each other and sending messages, electrochemical messages back and forth. And that's the basis of the functioning of the brain. So I'm going to have to finish soon, but I just wanted to show a few other things here. Here is a skull. That may be a real skull, I'm not sure, but it's not really a brain, that's jello. But the consistency of a living brain is somewhat like that. It's a little bit more firm than jello, but not much firm, much firmer. And here's what's going to happen if somebody bangs into something. You can see that the brain doesn't sit there, it sloshes back and forth. And that causes damage, like significant damage if it's fast, if you're hitting at a high velocity. And this could be a major problem, of course. And that could be, if I had 50 more hours, I could talk about that. Okay. But your brain is like jello, and I'm not trying to insult you or anything. Mine is too. So I'm not trying to insult anybody. Okay, so I do have a few more minutes here. I don't really see the timer, so but it doesn't matter because I can take questions after. Now, we want to avoid dementia. We want to avoid depression. We want to have more contentment. And so that's some of the things we want to try to do. Well, here you have a list of things that can help you and your brain. And we don't have time to talk about them all, but let's just talk about a few. One thing is to limit your alcohol intake. Now, the suggestions of how much alcohol is safe are changing, but it used to be only 1 glass a day. Okay, now they used to say that, but she's cheating because it's not just a glass that's up to the brim. That would actually be 2 glasses, actually. So she's trying to break the rule. It's only 1 glass. But she's not the worst. Some people want to have 1 glass of alcohol. This is red wine, but they want a very special glass. And here's a special glass, which is actually a full bottle of alcohol. And they say, finally, a wine glass that fits my needs. Actually, it's not your needs, it's your wants. And you're going to have to control that because that's not healthy. Okay, so let's take another look at one of these things. Another area is take regular exercise. Well, that's another thing that can help your brain. And luckily today we have Dr. Ko is talking about exercise to rejuvenate your brain. So that's wonderful. Another thing is eat a healthy diet. And that's another way to protect your brain. And we're lucky to have Dr. Mary talk about nutrition for brain health. And then finally, we have diseases of the brain. There's so many. If I had 60 hours, we could talk about them, but we don't have 60 hours. But luckily, we have Dr. Angela talking about the brain and long COVID. So I'm going to wrap up. Excuse me. Here are a few things that you can do starting today or starting tomorrow that will help your brain. Be social. Keep in touch with friends and family. Don't let yourself get isolated. It's not good for the brain. Engage your brain. Take a course, read a book, play games, play chess, do crossword puzzles, etc. These things can help the brain. Manage your stress. We all have stress, but you can learn to manage it. You can take stress management. You can adopt a whole bunch of things. I just don't have time to talk about it. Ongoing exercise. You don't have to be an athlete to get up and walk around the block. You know, you can do that, or you could play games. You could play golf, even if you're not very good. I'm not very good at all. I said, am I getting better? My friend said, not really. It's like, oh, okay, but it's good exercise. A restorative sleep. Some people think you don't even need to sleep much, but that's not true. Most people need 7 or 8 hours of sleep per night. If you miss a certain chunk of sleep, that's okay. You'll bounce back in the next several days. And eat right. Well, that one's a complicated one because they say eat right. They don't say eat delicious. But healthy food may not be as delicious as some foods that are not so great for us. So be balanced. You don't have to eat the perfect diet, but certainly there are things you could try to avoid, like too much salt, too much fat, etc., and try to eat more vegetables, fish, and fruits. So I don't even know how much time I have left, but I'm going to finish there, and I'm open to questions if people have some questions. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm willing for questions. If I don't know the answer, that won't be surprising to me, but I'll give it a shot. I'm sure you have lots of questions about the brain. One of the things is people do find the brain very interesting, fascinating, and to say that it's complex is an understatement. So I'm able and willing to be challenged with questions. Well, that's a great question. I'd have to do a whole session on that. Actually, interestingly enough, alcohol is amazingly damaging to the body in many, many different ways. It literally is poisonous in many ways. And in other ways, it's not so bad. In fact, people who are alcoholic and die from alcoholic liver disease, that's a major one, often have very good vessels and they don't have much arteriosclerosis. But that doesn't mean people should drink because it doesn't. It does help arteriosclerosis in some way, but it damages many other things, including the liver and the brain, etc. But that might be a topic for another session. But alcohol also has an unusual damaging effect on people indirectly, and this is public health because people drink alcohol and then they drink and drive, and that causes a massive amount of illness and death and destruction for the person who's drinking and driving, and also the people they hit. So this is where medicine became much more sophisticated, where they're saying, well, let's not just look at the biomedicine, let's look at the epidemiology and the social aspects. So drinking and driving is not obviously directly related to damage in the brain, but believe me, drinking and driving is one of the scourges of society in terms of people's behavior. So there we have medicine linking the brain, but the behavior of the individual, and then the consequences of inappropriate and immoral behavior, where they're driving and they hit people or they hit a tree, they die. Unfortunately, also they hit little kids, they hit other cars, and the tolls are terrible. And that's why drinking and driving was found to be a horrendously dangerous thing. Now, I'm old enough that when I was first driving, there weren't even laws against drinking and driving. Now it didn't happen to me, but if I had been drinking and driving, the cops would stop me and say, you're drunk and you're going all over the street. I think you should head home. So drive slower. Amazing. It's hard to imagine that, but that's the way the world has evolved. And now, of course, that they would impound the car after making the person take a breathalyzer, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just one of the things indirectly that alcohol can cause a problem indirectly in terms of social damaging behavior and then the consequences.
Well, thank you, Michael. So we've heard about the public aspects of alcohol consumption, the harm that it can cause, but also you mentioned to other organs of the body. What about specifically, if I can follow up on that,
yeah, sure.
Specifically for the brain, like in terms of maybe, I don't know, brain development, or does it cause any, I don't know, brain damage, neuron affected?
Thank you. I think it's Alex. I'm not even sure. So thanks, Alex. Yeah, there's so many things that I couldn't possibly answer it well, but it can damage brain cells. I mean, people can actually drink to the extent of just dying from the toxicity of alcohol. So sometimes I just read just recently a man on holiday, a British man on holiday. He had a contest with two young women to drink all the drinks at the list of drinks in the bar. And he only got halfway through, and then he went to his room sick, and then he just died, 52-year-old man or something. That's a stupid contest. Actually, that's really stupid. And he died. But other people die because they have drinking contests and they just die from the toxicity of alcohol. Now, that's not a usual way. Other things it can do is that somebody can get inebriated, drunk, and they fall down and they hit their head. And then they have a subdural hematoma. They have a bleed in the brain, and that can kill them. So there's a bunch of other things. Now, regular drinking may not damage the brain directly, usually, but it can damage the liver over time. And then the liver and the brain are connected in such a way that sometimes that will eventually cause brain damage as well. It's usually a longer lasting kind of alcohol consumption that is extreme. But don't forget that just a little bit of alcohol can make somebody drunk, and they could vomit, and they could sorry, these details, because we're doctors here, so we need to talk about it. They can vomit, and then they aspirate their vomit, and then they can't breathe and they die. So people die from getting drunk, vomiting, and then breathing in the vomit goes into the lungs. They can't breathe properly and they die. So that's another way. And so you can start to see how many different pathways from drinking. Now, am I saying that drinking itself is intrinsically terrible? No, but it isn't. And then on the other hand, it can be quite dangerous. There's also fetal alcohol syndrome, when a mother who is pregnant is drinking, and that goes across the placenta and enters the fetus and embryo, and can damage the baby. And so there's fetal alcohol syndrome. Somebody's born with brain damage. So there's another way. So you could see that we could probably spend a whole hour or 2 hours on this topic. It would be a little bit depressing though, but I think maybe a warning. Well, that's a great question. And ultimately, we do know a lot more about the brain than we used to. You know, way back when, before science took over, I mean, at least modern science took over, the ancient Greeks were really smart about philosophy, but Aristotle thought the brain was an air conditioner for the blood. So the heart was the center of consciousness and emotion, and the brain was an air conditioner for the blood, because the blood was hot and needed to be cooled down. Wrong. Aristotle, you were wrong. He's about 100,000 times smarter than me, but he got that one wrong. In any case, other ancient experts did start to realize that the brain was important. But the brain is so complicated. It was only in the last few hundred years they could actually start to figure out the brain, because the functioning aspect of the brain are cells. But they didn't have the microscope until about 300 years ago. So they couldn't even see the brain cells, because they didn't even know they existed. And then even after they got the microscope, if you look at pieces of brain under the microscope, you don't see much at all. You need special stains. And so they had to get special stains that they could use to look at the cells. And then they could start to see the brain. And so we've come a long way. And then they went, well, how does the brain work? Well, it works on a very microscopic way, actually submicroscopic. And then they started to recognize it's bioelectrical, but it's very chemical as well. And so there's a lot of neurotransmitters, which are chemicals that communicate from one cell to the next. And so a lot of the research into the brain is only sort of moving forward. So they do have knowledge of certain areas of the brain that are for language, and other areas for movement, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to higher intellectual capacities like reading, and then also thinking and cognition and planning, they do have some ideas of where it is. Often the frontal lobe is a major part, but usually the frontal lobe works with other lobes of the brain. So the brain is so complicated, it's very hard to study the brain. And so in a sense, a lot of this would be indirect evidence that they find that if people are actively mentally in reading or taking courses, etc., then their tendency is to have a healthier brain and a healthier mood. They're happier and so on. And so it's not directly, they can't really identify, as far as I know, the areas of the brain that are so much involved. Now, the other thing in the brain is that parts of the brain work together. It's not like one little nodule in one area does everything. It's more like distributed around the brain, which makes it even more difficult to figure it out. And so they are making progress, but they can't really identify exactly where that would be. Now, reading, you can imagine it takes to read most of the time, but there's Braille, so you don't need eyes, you don't need vision, but most of the time you're going to look at something and then you're going to have to see it. So that's the visual system. And then you're going to have to interpret what these little marks on paper are. And that's going to be in the somatosensory area. And so, but it's going to be a complicated area of visual cortex. Now, when I did a master's in brain, and there's a primary visual cortex. Okay, fine. But now I hear that there's 20 different areas of visual cortex. So it's almost like there's a kind of raw data coming from the eyes, and then it's specialized. There's different areas of the brain which specialize in different things like movement and so on. One special area is faces. So human brains are very interested in faces. And that's why we can look at a cartoon and we sort of get a sense, oh, that little cartoon is a being. Why would we think that? Well, because they have a face, and that makes us, in a sense, we're triggered by that, and it looks something like a being. We might see it as a cartoon character, but we do see it as a character, partly because our brains are attracted by faces, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think that's a great answer, but that if he wants more, he can contact